The first time I noticed Tommy walking circles around our house at 2 a.m., I thought I was dreaming. Our two-story colonial home in Millbrook, Connecticut, sits on a quiet cul-de-sac where the only sounds after midnight are the occasional car passing on Route 7 and the distant hum of the interstate. But there he was, my 8-year-old son, barefoot in his Spider-Man pajamas, methodically walking the perimeter of our property like a soldier on patrol. I pressed my face against the cold bedroom window, my breath fogging the glass as I watched him move through the autumn moonlight. The October air was crisp, and I could see his breath forming small clouds as he walked. His steps were deliberate, measured, not the erratic movement of a sleepwalker, but something far more purposeful and unsettling. "David, wake up," I whispered, shaking my husband's shoulder. But David was deep in sleep, exhausted from another 12-hour shift at the Hartford insurance office. He'd been working overtime for months, trying to secure the promotion that would finally give us the financial stability we'd been chasing since Tommy was born. I grabbed my robe and slippers, moving quietly through our house. The hardwood floors creaked under my feet as I navigated past Tommy's room, his bed empty, sheets thrown back carelessly. The front door was unlocked, something that sent a chill down my spine. We lived in a safe neighborhood, but leaving doors unlocked wasn't something we did, especially not with recent break-ins reported just 2 towns over. When I stepped onto our front porch, the cold October air hit me like a slap. Tommy was halfway around the house, moving along the eastern side where Sarah Morrison's house cast long shadows across our yard. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even seem to see me. His eyes were open, but there was something distant about his expression, like he was looking through the world rather than at it. "Tommy," I called softly, not wanting to startle him. I'd read somewhere that waking a sleepwalker abruptly could be dangerous. "Honey, what are you doing?" He stopped then, turning to face me with that same distant expression. In the moonlight, his face looked pale, almost ethereal. "I have to make sure, Mommy," he said, his voice carrying an odd formality that made my stomach tighten. "I have to make sure everything is safe." "Safe from what, baby?" I asked, moving closer to him. The grass was wet with dew, and I could feel the moisture seeping through my slippers. Tommy looked at me for a long moment, and for a second, I saw my little boy again, the one who still asked me to check under his bed for monsters, who insisted on leaving his bedroom door cracked open because complete darkness scared him. But then that distant look returned, and he simply said, "I have to finish the circle." I wanted to scoop him up and carry him inside, but something about his demeanor stopped me. Instead, I followed him as he completed his circuit around our house, past the backyard where his swing set sat motionless in the still air, past the garden where my late-blooming roses were finally starting to wilt, and back to the front yard. Only when he'd completed the full circle did he seem to snap out of whatever trance he'd been in. He blinked several times, looking around as if seeing his surroundings for the first time. "Mommy, why are we outside?" he asked, his voice now carrying the normal inflection of a confused 8-year-old. "You were walking, honey," I said, kneeling down to his level. "Do you remember anything about it?" He shook his head, and I could see he was starting to shiver. "I was having a dream about the man," he said, wrapping his arms around himself. "The man who watches." "What man, Tommy?" But he just shook his head again, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "Can we go inside now? I'm cold." I carried him back to his room, tucking him into bed and sitting with him until his breathing became deep and regular. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed in our quiet Connecticut home. As I lay awake beside David, listening to his steady breathing, I found myself straining to hear any sound from Tommy's room, any indication that he might be getting up again. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been an isolated incident, a one-time sleepwalking episode brought on by stress or growing pains. Tommy seemed completely normal at breakfast, chattering about his upcoming school presentation on dinosaurs and complaining about the cafeteria's meatloaf. David listened with half an ear while scrolling through emails on his phone, already mentally at the office. But as the day wore on, I found myself dreading nightfall. And my instincts proved correct. At exactly 2 a.m., I heard the soft click of Tommy's door opening, followed by the gentle creak of the front door. This time, I was ready. I watched from the living room window as Tommy began his methodical circuit around the house, and I realized with growing unease that his path was exactly the same as the night before. Same starting point, same pace, same distant expression. Whatever was happening to my son, it wasn't random. It was ritualistic, purposeful, and absolutely terrifying. By the end of the first week, I had filled 3 pages of a notebook with observations about Tommy's nightly walks. The ritual was unerringly consistent. 2 a.m. exactly, always beginning at the northeast corner of our property, always moving clockwise, always taking exactly 12 minutes to complete one full circuit. I had tried everything I could think of to prevent it. I'd moved a chair in front of his bedroom door. Somehow he'd gotten around it without making a sound. I'd considered installing a lock on the outside of his door, but couldn't bring myself to trap my own child in his room. I'd even tried staying awake in his room, sitting in the reading chair where I used to tell him bedtime stories, but each time I'd inexplicably fallen asleep around 1:30 a.m., only to wake up at 2:15 to find him gone. David remained skeptical, despite my increasingly frantic attempts to wake him. "Kids sleepwalk, Rachel," he'd say, not even looking up from his morning coffee and Wall Street Journal. "My brother used to make sandwiches in his sleep. Tommy will grow out of it." But this wasn't ordinary sleepwalking. I'd researched extensively, reading everything from medical journals to parenting forums. Sleepwalkers were typically clumsy, disoriented, prone to bumping into things. Tommy moved with purpose and precision, never stumbling, never hesitating. His path around the house was so consistent that I began to notice he was wearing a faint trail in the grass. On Thursday night, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of watching from inside, I waited on the front porch, wrapped in a thick blanket against the October chill. When Tommy emerged from the house, I fell into step behind him, maintaining a distance of about 10 feet. "Tommy," I said softly as we walked along the eastern side of the house, "can you tell me what you're looking for?" He didn't respond immediately, continuing his steady pace past the basement windows and around toward the backyard. But then, as we approached the corner where our property line met the Hendersons' yard, he stopped abruptly. "He's not here tonight," Tommy said, his voice carrying that same formal tone that had become so familiar. "Who's not here?" I asked, moving closer to him. Tommy pointed toward the line of oak trees that separated our property from the Hendersons'. The trees were old, their branches creating a canopy that blocked most of the moonlight. In the deep shadows between the trunks, I could make out the vague shapes of Mr. Henderson's garden shed and the wooden fence that had seen better days. "The man who watches," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "He usually stands right there, by the big tree. But he's not there tonight." I felt ice form in my veins. "Tommy, there's no one there. There's never anyone there." But even as I said it, I found myself staring into those shadows, straining to see if there was something I'd missed. The darkness seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my eyes. A branch creaked in the wind, and I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He's tall," Tommy continued, resuming his walk as if discussing the weather. "Taller than Daddy. And he wears a dark coat. He doesn't move much, just watches. But sometimes—" Tommy paused, tilting his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Sometimes he follows me." "Follows you where?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. "Around the house. He walks behind me, but he stays in the shadows. He's very quiet, but I can hear him. His shoes make a soft sound on the grass." We completed the circuit in silence, and when we reached the front door, Tommy turned to me with suddenly clear eyes. "Mommy, why are you outside?" I knelt down and took his hands in mine. They were ice cold. "Tommy, do you remember what you just told me about the man who watches?" He looked genuinely confused. "What man?" The next day, I called Tommy's pediatrician, Dr. Martinez, who had been seeing him since birth. She was a practical woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach to parenting concerns. Sleep disturbances in children Tommy's age are actually quite common, she explained during our phone consultation. Has there been any unusual stress at home? Changes in routine? School problems? I found myself hesitating. How could I explain that my son claimed to see a man who watched him from our neighbor's trees? How could I convey the ritualistic nature of his nighttime walks without sounding like an overprotective mother letting her imagination run wild? He's been having some vivid dreams, I said finally. And the sleepwalking is very systematic. I'd like to see him, Dr. Martinez said. Can you bring him in tomorrow afternoon? That night, I positioned myself differently. Instead of following Tommy, I stationed myself at the kitchen window that faced the backyard, giving me a clear view of the tree line he'd pointed to. I had David's binoculars, though I felt slightly ridiculous using them to spy on my own backyard. At 2 a.m., Tommy began his circuit. I tracked his movement until he reached the back corner of our property, the spot where he'd stopped the night before. Through the binoculars, I watched him pause and look toward the trees. And that's when I saw him. A figure, tall and still, standing in the shadows between the oak trees. The moonlight didn't quite reach him, but I could make out his general shape, broad shoulders, what appeared to be a long coat, and an unnatural stillness that made my breath catch in my throat. I lowered the binoculars and looked again with my naked eye. Nothing. Just shadows and swaying branches. But when I raised the binoculars again, he was there. Watching. Waiting. And as Tommy completed his circuit and headed back toward the house, I swear I saw the figure begin to move, following along the tree line, keeping pace with my son's steady walk. The appointment with Dr. Martinez yielded no immediate answers. Tommy's physical examination was normal, his reflexes sharp, his responses age-appropriate. When she asked him about his dreams, he described typical 8-year-old nightmares, monsters under the bed, getting lost at school, forgetting his homework. No mention of any man who watches? I asked quietly while Tommy was distracted by a toy in the corner of the examination room. Dr. Martinez shook her head. Children often don't remember details from sleepwalking episodes, she explained. The brain is in a different state during these incidents. What he tells you during the episodes may not represent actual memories or perceptions. But I knew what I'd seen through those binoculars. The figure in the trees hadn't been a trick of light or shadow, it had been substantial, real, purposeful. I'd like to refer you to a sleep specialist, Dr. Martinez continued. Dr. Susan Chen at Hartford Hospital has excellent success with pediatric sleep disorders. In the meantime, I'm going to prescribe a very mild sleep aid that should help Tommy stay in deeper sleep phases. The medication arrived 3 days later, but I found myself reluctant to give it to Tommy. What if the deep sleep prevented him from sensing danger? What if whatever was watching our house decided to do more than just watch? David's attitude began to shift on the night I finally got him to stay awake and observe Tommy's ritual for himself. I'd been begging him for nearly 2 weeks to witness what was happening, but between his work schedule and his natural tendency to dismiss what he couldn't immediately understand, he'd managed to avoid confronting the reality of our situation. One night, I'd finally said, cornering him in our bedroom as he prepared for bed. Just one night, David. Stay awake and watch your son walk around our house like he's guarding it from something. Then tell me it's normal sleepwalking. He'd agreed, more to appease me than out of genuine concern, but when 2 a.m. arrived and we watched Tommy rise from his bed with that same purposeful expression, I saw David's skepticism begin to crumble. Jesus Christ, he whispered as we followed Tommy outside. He's like a little soldier. We maintained our distance as Tommy began his circuit, but I could feel David's growing unease. This was his son, his little boy who still asked for help tying his shoes, moving through the night with an adult's sense of purpose and awareness. Tommy, David called softly when we reached the back corner of the property. What are you doing, buddy? Tommy stopped and turned to face his father. In the moonlight, his face looked older, more serious than any 8-year-old should. I'm keeping watch, Daddy. Like you do at work. Keeping watch for what? For the man who's been coming closer, Tommy said, pointing toward the tree line. He used to stay by the big oak, but now he comes almost to our fence. I think he's waiting for something. David followed Tommy's gaze, and I saw his expression change. The tree line was deep in shadow, but something about the darkness seemed different that night. More solid, more intentional. There's nothing there, son, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. He's there, Tommy insisted. He's always there. But he's closer tonight. That's when we heard it. A soft sound from the direction of the trees. Not quite a footstep, but the sound of something moving through the underbrush. David's hand found mine, and I felt the tension in his grip. Stay here, he whispered, then called out more loudly. Hello? Is someone there? The sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against our eardrums. Even the usual night sounds, insects, the distant highway, the occasional car, seemed to have been swallowed by the darkness. Tommy completed his circuit, and we escorted him back to his room. But David didn't go back to sleep. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, still in his pajamas, staring out the window toward the tree line. There was someone there, he said finally. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. Like when you know someone's watching you. I sat down across from him, relief flooding through me. For weeks, I'd felt like I was losing my mind, seeing things that weren't there, overreacting to a simple case of childhood sleepwalking. But David had felt it too, that presence, that sense of being observed. What do we do? I asked. David was quiet for a long moment. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk to the Hendersons. Find out if they've seen anything unusual. And I'm going to set up the security camera system I've been meaning to install. The Hendersons have been in Florida for 3 weeks, I reminded him. They're snowbirds. They don't come back until after Christmas. Then who's been taking care of their property? David asked. I felt that familiar chill run down my spine. I don't know. I assumed they had a service, but I haven't seen anyone. The next morning, David called in sick to work, something he'd never done in the 12 years I'd known him. Instead, he spent the day installing motion-activated cameras around our property, positioning them to cover the areas where Tommy walked and, more importantly, to monitor the tree line where we'd both sensed that watching presence. If someone's been lurking around our property, we'll have proof, he said, adjusting the angle of the camera that faced the backyard. And if it's just our imagination, we'll have proof of that too. But I already knew what the cameras would show. The question wasn't whether someone was watching us, it was who he was and what he wanted with our son. The first week of camera footage was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The motion sensors captured Tommy's nightly circuits with crystal clarity, documenting the precise timing and route of his walks. What the cameras also revealed was that we weren't imagining the presence in the trees. David and I spent hours reviewing the footage on his laptop, frame by frame. At first glance, the videos seemed to show nothing more than Tommy walking alone around our property. But when we adjusted the contrast and brightness, enhancing the darker areas of the image, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. There, I said, pointing to the screen. Do you see that? David squinted at the monitor. We were watching footage from Tuesday night, the camera angle showing the back corner of our property where Tommy always paused. In the enhanced image, a tall figure was clearly visible among the trees, perfectly still, watching. It could be a tree trunk, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Trees don't move, I replied, advancing the footage. Watch. As Tommy continued his circuit, the figure shifted position, maintaining its line of sight on my son. It was subtle, a slight repositioning, a turn of what appeared to be a head, but it was unmistakably movement. Jesus! David whispered. How long has this been going on? We had 10 days of footage, and the pattern was consistent. Every night at 2 a.m., Tommy would begin his walk, and every night, the figure would be there, watching from the trees. But what was most disturbing was the progression we could see over the course of those 10 days. On the first night, the figure stayed deep in the shadows, barely visible even with enhancement. But each subsequent night, it seemed to move closer to our property line. By the 10th night, it was standing at the very edge of the tree line, separated from our backyard by only the low wooden fence. We need to call the police, I said, but David shook his head. And show them what? Enhanced footage of shadows that could be anything? They'll think we're paranoid parents having a breakdown. He was right, of course. The footage was suggestive but not conclusive. Without clearer evidence, we'd sound like conspiracy theorists. Then what do we do? I asked. David was quiet for a long moment, studying the most recent footage. Tomorrow night, I'm going to be out there waiting for him. David, that's not. I'll be armed, he interrupted. And I'll position myself where I can see the tree line clearly. If someone's been stalking our property, watching our son, I want to know who and why. I felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the October weather. What if he's dangerous? What if confronting him puts Tommy in more danger? Doing nothing is putting Tommy in danger, David replied, his voice hard with determination. Our son is sleepwalking every night to patrol our property because some part of his subconscious knows we're being watched. That's not normal behavior, Rachel. That's the behavior of a child who senses a threat. The next day, David took another sick day and spent it researching the Hendersons' property. He discovered that they'd indeed hired a caretaking service, but when he called the company, he learned that their contract had ended 3 weeks ago. So who's been on their property? I asked. That's what I intend to find out, David said grimly. That evening, he prepared like he was going to war. He loaded his hunting rifle, checked his flashlight, and dressed in dark clothes that would help him blend into the shadows. At 1:45 a.m., he positioned himself behind the garden shed, with a clear view of both Tommy's usual route and the tree line where our uninvited observer had been appearing. I watched from the kitchen window, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. At exactly 2 a.m., Tommy's bedroom door opened, and he began his nightly ritual. I tracked his movement until he reached the back corner of our property, where he stopped and looked toward the trees. Through the binoculars, I could see David crouched behind the shed, rifle ready. I could also see the figure in the trees, clearer tonight than ever before, standing just at the edge of the fence line. Tommy stood motionless for several minutes, longer than usual. Then, something happened that made my blood run cold. Tommy raised his hand and pointed directly at the figure in the trees. "He's there," I heard him say, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "He's been waiting for you." David stepped out from behind the shed, rifle raised, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Don't move," he shouted. "Put your hands where I can see them." The figure didn't run. Instead, it stepped forward into the light, and I saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall, just as Tommy had described, wearing a long dark coat that seemed to absorb the flashlight beam. But what made me gasp was his face, or rather, the absence of clear features. In the harsh LED light, his face seemed to shift and blur, as if I was looking at him through water. "Who are you?" David demanded, keeping the rifle trained on the figure. "Why have you been watching my family?" The figure tilted its head, and when it spoke, its voice carried across the yard with unnatural clarity. "I'm waiting for him to be ready." "Ready for what?" "To remember what he forgot." Tommy, still standing in his spot near the fence, nodded as if this made perfect sense. "He says I used to know him, before I was born." David's hands shook as he kept the rifle aimed at the figure. "You stay away from my son," You stay away from my family. The figure took another step forward, and I could see it more clearly now. It wasn't quite human. The proportions were wrong, the movements too fluid. He calls to me, it said. Every night, he calls to me. I'm only answering. Tommy doesn't call to anyone, David said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Ask him, the figure replied. Ask him what he says when he walks. David looked at Tommy, who was still standing motionless, still pointing at the figure. Tommy, what do you say when you walk around the house? Tommy's voice was distant, dreamy. I say, come back. Come back. It's time to come back. The figure smiled, and I saw teeth that were too sharp, too many. He remembers. Deep down, he remembers me. That's when David fired the rifle. The gunshot shattered the October night like breaking glass. Birds exploded from the trees, and dogs began barking throughout the neighborhood. But the figure didn't fall. Instead, it stepped backward into the shadows, becoming indistinct again, and then it was gone. Not running, not fleeing, but simply dissolving back into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. Tommy collapsed. One moment he was standing with his arm extended, pointing at the space where the figure had been, and the next he was crumpled on the ground, unconscious. David dropped the rifle and ran to him, scooping him up in his arms. Tommy! Tommy, wake up! David's voice was raw with panic. I ran outside, my bare feet slipping on the wet grass. Tommy was completely limp in David's arms, his breathing shallow but steady. His skin was cold, colder than it should have been even in the October air. We need to get him to the hospital, I said, but even as I spoke, Tommy's eyes fluttered open. Daddy, he said, looking around in confusion. Why are we outside? Why do you have your gun? David and I exchanged glances. Tommy, do you remember anything? Do you remember the man in the trees? Tommy's face scrunched up in concentration. I had a dream, he said slowly. There was a man and he was waiting for me. He said he'd been waiting for a long time. What else did he say? I asked gently. He said I used to be his friend. Before I was born, I was his friend. And he's been lonely without me. Tommy's voice was getting stronger, more alert. But that's silly, right? You can't be friends with someone before you're born. David carried Tommy back to the house, and we tucked him into bed. He fell asleep almost immediately, as if the entire episode had drained him of energy. But David and I sat in the kitchen until dawn, trying to process what we'd witnessed. What the hell was that thing? David asked for the dozenth time. I don't know, I replied, though I'd been thinking about it all night. But Tommy knew it. Whatever it was, Tommy recognized it. Kids don't have memories from before they're born, David said, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. No, I agreed. They don't. The next morning, I called Dr. Martinez and scheduled an emergency appointment. When I tried to explain what had happened, she listened with professional patience, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. Rachel, you and David have been under a lot of stress with Tommy's sleepwalking. Sometimes, when we're sleep-deprived and anxious, we can experience shared hallucinations or… David shot at it, I interrupted. He fired his rifle at this thing. There was a pause. Are you saying David discharged a firearm in your backyard? Yes, but… I'm going to need you to bring Tommy in immediately. And Rachel, I'm also going to recommend that you and David consider speaking with someone about the stress you've been experiencing. The appointment was scheduled for that afternoon, but Tommy seemed completely normal. He ate his breakfast, chatted about his school day, and showed no signs of the strange behavior that had been plaguing our nights. When I asked him about his dreams, he just shrugged. I don't remember my dreams anymore, he said. I sleep really good now. That night, for the first time in weeks, Tommy slept through until morning. No 2 a.m. walk. No ritualistic circling of our property. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt a growing sense of unease. Maybe it's over, David said as we watched the clock tick past 2:30 a.m. Maybe whatever was happening, it's finished. But I kept thinking about the figure's words. I'm waiting for him to be ready. Ready for what? And if Tommy was no longer sleepwalking, no longer calling out to whatever had been watching from the trees, what did that mean? Over the next few days, I found myself studying Tommy for any sign of change. He seemed happy, energetic, normal in every way. But there were small things that nagged at me. His drawings, which had always been typical kid art, stick figures and crayon houses, had become more sophisticated. He'd drawn a picture of our house that showed architectural details I didn't think he'd ever noticed. And in the background of the drawing, barely visible unless you looked closely, was a tall figure standing among the trees. "Who's that?" I asked, pointing to the figure. Tommy looked at the drawing with mild interest. "Just a friend," he said. "He's waiting for me to get older." "What happens when you get older?" "Then I can visit him properly," Tommy said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Right now, I can only visit him at night, when I'm sleeping. But when I'm older, I can visit him during the day too." I felt ice form in my stomach. "Tommy, you don't visit anyone at night. You sleep in your bed." Tommy looked at me with an expression that was far too knowing for an 8-year-old. "I know you think that, Mommy. But I go lots of places when I sleep. I go to the place where my friend lives, and we talk about things." "What kind of things?" "About when I'm ready to come home." "But you are home, sweetheart. This is your home." Tommy smiled, but it wasn't quite his usual smile. "This is where I live now," he said. "But it's not where I'm from." That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in Tommy's room, watching him sleep, and at exactly 2 a.m., something changed. Tommy's breathing became deeper, more rhythmic, and his body went completely still. But his eyes opened, and they were looking directly at me. "He's here," Tommy said, his voice carrying that formal tone I'd grown to dread. "He's been waiting for you to understand." "Understand what?" "That some of us don't belong here. Some of us are just visiting." And then Tommy smiled, and I saw teeth that were too sharp, too many, just like the figure in the trees. I didn't wake David. Instead, I sat in Tommy's room for the rest of the night, watching him sleep with that unsettling smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. His breathing was too regular, too controlled, like he was consciously managing each breath rather than sleeping naturally. When morning came, Tommy woke up as normal as ever, chattering about his planned playdate with his friend Marcus, asking for chocolate chip pancakes, complaining about having to wear his good shoes to school. But I couldn't shake the image of those teeth, or the way he'd looked at me in the darkness. After David left for work and Tommy left for school, I found myself alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of urgency. I needed answers, and I needed them before whatever was happening to Tommy progressed further. I started with the Henderson house. Using the spare key they'd given us years ago for emergencies, I let myself into their property. The house was clean, well-maintained, clearly being cared for by someone. But as I walked through the rooms, I noticed things that didn't fit with the elderly couple I'd known for 5 years. In the living room, there were books on subjects the Hendersons would never have read: ancient folklore, pre-Christian spirituality, something called The Threshold Between Worlds. In the kitchen, I found a calendar with dates marked in red ink, and when I counted back, I realized the marked dates corresponded exactly with the nights Tommy had been sleepwalking. But it was the basement that made me understand the true scope of what we were dealing with. The basement had been converted into something between a study and a shrine. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, showing children from different decades, different eras. Some were in black and white, others in the faded color of old Polaroids. But what they all had in common was the same distant expression I'd seen on Tommy's face during his nightly walks. And in every photograph, somewhere in the background, was the same tall figure in the dark coat. There were journals too, handwritten accounts dating back decades. I pulled one from the shelf at random and began reading. The boy came to me in 1987, just as the others had. 7 years old, walking circles around his family's property, calling out in his sleep. The parents thought it was sleepwalking, just as they always do. But I knew better. I knew he was one of them, one of the children who remember. I flipped through more pages, my hands shaking. The process takes time. The human form is resilient, resistant to remembering its true nature. But eventually, they all remember. Eventually, they all go home. The youngest was 5 when she remembered. She simply walked out of her house one morning and never returned. The authorities searched for weeks, but they were looking in the wrong places. She didn't go anywhere in this world. The journal fell from my hands. I grabbed another one, this one more recent. Thomas Michael Chen, age 8, 47 Maple Street. Began walking at 2 a.m. on October 15th. Strong response, clear recognition. The process should be complete within the month. His mother is observant, his father skeptical but learning. They will try to interfere, as they always do. But it doesn't matter. What calls to them is stronger than human bonds. I ran from the basement, from the house, my mind reeling. The journal entries spanned decades, describing dozens of children who had exhibited the same behavior as Tommy. And according to the writer, they had all eventually gone home, disappearing without a trace. I drove straight to the Hartford Public Library, where I spent the next 4 hours researching missing children in our area. What I found made my blood run cold. Going back 30 years, there had been 17 cases of children who had simply vanished from their homes, leaving no trace. The ages ranged from 5 to 9, and in every case, the parents had reported unusual behavior in the weeks before the disappearance. Sleepwalking, strange dreams, conversations with invisible friends. But what was most disturbing was the pattern. Every 7 years, like clockwork, another child would disappear. And according to my calculations, Tommy was right on schedule. I called David from the library parking lot. "I need you to come home," I said. "Right now. Don't ask questions, just come home." "Rachel, I can't just leave work." "The Peterson account." "David, someone has been documenting Tommy's behavior. Someone has been planning this for months. There are journals, photographs, records of other children who disappeared. Tommy is in danger." The line went quiet for a long moment. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, David said finally. While I waited for him, I drove to Tommy's school. I needed to see him, to confirm he was safe, to reassure myself that he was still my little boy. But when I arrived at Millbrook Elementary, the secretary informed me that Tommy had been picked up early. "By whom?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "His grandfather," she said, checking her log. "Nice gentleman. Tommy was so excited to see him." "We don't have any grandfathers alive," I said, my voice coming out as a whisper. The secretary's face went pale. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait here while I call the principal and the police." I didn't wait. I ran to my car and drove home, praying that somehow there had been a mistake, that Tommy would be there waiting for me. But the house was empty, and David's car wasn't in the driveway yet. I called his cell phone. "David, where are you?" "I'm 5 minutes away." "What's wrong?" "You sound." Someone took Tommy from school. They pretended to be his grandfather and took him. Jesus Christ. "Have you called the police?" "I'm calling them now." But before I could dial, I heard the front door open. "Mommy." Tommy's voice called out. "I'm home." I ran to the front door, relief flooding through me. Tommy was standing in the entryway, his backpack slung over his shoulder, looking completely normal. Behind him stood a man I'd never seen before, elderly, well-dressed, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "You must be Mrs. Chen," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Abraham Hendricks. I believe you've been staying in my house." "The Hendersons?" I asked, confused. "My tenants, yes. They've been very helpful in allowing me to continue my research. I apologize for the confusion at the school. I should have introduced myself properly before picking up Tommy." "Research?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dr. Hendricks smiled. "Tommy is very special, Mrs. Chen. He's one of the few children who remember their true nature. I've been studying children like him for over 40 years. Tommy looked up at Dr. Hendricks with obvious affection. "He's been teaching me about where I really come from," Tommy said. "And he says it's almost time for me to go home." "You are home," I said firmly, reaching for Tommy's hand. "This is your home." "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Hendricks said gently, "I understand this is difficult to accept, but Tommy doesn't belong in this world. He's been trying to tell you that for weeks. He's 8 years old. He belongs with his family." "His family isn't human," Dr. Hendricks said, and his kind expression never changed. "Oh, you've raised him well, and I can see that you love him dearly. But the being you call your son is simply borrowing this form. When children like Tommy are born, they forget their true nature for a time. But eventually they remember. And when they remember, they go home." David's car pulled into the driveway, and I heard him slam the door. "Tommy!" he called out. "Tommy, where are you?" "In here, Daddy." Tommy called back, and when David appeared in the doorway, Tommy ran to him. "Daddy, this is Dr. Hendricks. He's been helping me remember things." David looked at Dr. Hendricks with undisguised suspicion. "You're the one who took my son from school without permission." "I am the one who has been caring for your son in ways you cannot," Dr. Hendricks replied calmly. "The nightly walks, the sense of being watched, the feeling that something is wrong, all of that will stop once Tommy accepts what he is and returns to where he belongs." "And where is that exactly?" David asked, moving protectively in front of Tommy. Dr. Hendricks gestured toward the window, toward the tree line where we'd seen the figure. "There are places between worlds, Mr. Chen. Spaces where beings who don't quite fit in either realm can exist. Tommy is from such a place, and he's been calling out to return there since he was old enough to walk." "That's insane," David said. "Is it?" Dr. Hendricks asked. "Have you ever noticed that Tommy doesn't quite fit? That he's always been a little different from other children? More aware, more intelligent, more otherworldly." I felt a chill because, in truth, I had noticed these things. Tommy had always been precocious, had always seemed to understand things that other children his age didn't. When he was 4, he'd ask me why people were afraid of dying when it was just like going to sleep in one place and waking up in another. When he was 6, he'd drawn a picture of our house that included architectural details from the building plans we'd never shown him. "Every parent thinks their child is special," I said weakly. "Not like this," Dr. Hendricks said. "Tommy, would you like to show your parents what you've learned?" Tommy looked up at Dr. Hendricks, then at us. "Will it scare them?" "Perhaps a little. But they need to understand." Tommy nodded and walked to the center of the room. He closed his eyes and stood very still, and gradually, the air around him began to shimmer. It was subtle at first, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but it grew stronger until Tommy appeared to be standing in a different place entirely. Instead of our living room, he seemed to be standing in a vast space filled with soft, silver light. And around him, I could see other figures, tall, graceful beings that moved with the same fluid motion as the figure we'd seen in the trees. They were beautiful in a way that made my eyes water, and they were all looking at Tommy with what could only be described as love. "He's been homesick," Dr. Hendricks said softly. And they've been waiting for him to remember how to come home. The shimmer faded, and Tommy opened his eyes. He looked at us with an expression of infinite sadness. "I love you both so much," he said. "But I don't belong here. I never did." That night, none of us slept. Tommy sat between David and me on our bed, holding both our hands, while Dr. Hendricks explained what he called the transition process from the chair in the corner of our room. "It's not death," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's simply going home. Tommy will still exist, still be himself, but he'll be where he belongs." "And we'll never see him again," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Not in this form, no. But Mrs. Chen, the love you have for Tommy, the love he has for you, that doesn't disappear. It transcends the boundaries between worlds." David's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. "There has to be another way. There has to be a way for him to stay." "There is," Dr. Hendricks said quietly. "But it would mean Tommy living his entire life feeling incomplete, feeling like he's in the wrong place. He would never be truly happy, never be truly at peace. I've seen children who resist the call. They become increasingly disturbed, increasingly disconnected from the world around them. Some become violent. Some retreat so far into themselves that they stop responding to anything at all." Tommy squeezed my hand. "Mommy, I don't want to be sad my whole life. And I don't want to hurt anyone." "You could never hurt anyone, sweetheart." "But I could," Tommy said, and there was something in his voice that made me look at him more closely. Dr. Hendricks showed me pictures of other children who tried to stay. Some of them did terrible things because they couldn't handle being in the wrong place. I thought about the journals I'd found, the references to children who had disappeared. What happened to the ones who went home? I asked Dr. Hendricks. "They found peace," he said simply. "They found where they belonged." "And the ones who stayed?" Dr. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. "There have been incidents. Children who couldn't reconcile their true nature with their human form. The results were tragic." David stood up abruptly. "I need to think. I need to process this." He started pacing the room. "Let's say, for the sake of argument, that everything you're telling us is true. Tommy is some kind of otherworldly being who was born into a human family. Why? How does that happen?" "Sometimes," Dr. Hendricks said, "when the barrier between worlds is thin, souls can cross over. They're drawn to loving families, to places where they can experience human emotion and connection. But eventually, they remember what they are." "So Tommy chose us?" I asked. "In a sense, yes. He was drawn to the love you had to offer, the family you would provide. But he was never meant to stay permanently." Tommy looked up at me with eyes that seemed much older than 8 years. I wanted to know what it felt like to have a mommy and daddy. I wanted to know what it felt like to be loved by humans. "And now you know," I said, my voice breaking. "Now I know," Tommy agreed. "And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. But I can't stay. I can feel myself getting wrong, different, and I'm scared of what I might become if I don't go home." Over the next few hours, Dr. Hendricks told us more about his research. He'd been studying children like Tommy for decades, documenting their stories, trying to understand the phenomenon. Some families had tried to keep their children, and the results had been uniformly tragic. "There was a boy in 1992, he said. "His parents refused to let him go. They moved across the country, changed their names, tried to hide from what he was. But you can't hide from your true nature. By the time he was 12, he'd become violent, unpredictable. He hurt other children, hurt his own parents. Eventually, he disappeared anyway, but by then, the damage was done." "And if we let Tommy go?" David asked. "Then he transitions peacefully," surrounded by love. The beings who wait for him aren't malevolent, Mr. Chen. They're his family, his people. They've been waiting patiently for him to remember. As dawn broke over our neighborhood, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape that had been our home for 8 years, I realized that we weren't really being given a choice. Tommy was going to leave, either willingly, with our blessing, or eventually, in a way that might damage him permanently. When? I asked. Tonight, Dr. Hendricks said. The barrier is thinnest during the new moon, and tonight is the last new moon before winter sets in. If we wait longer, the transition becomes more difficult. So we have one day, David said. One more day with our son. One more day to love him and let him know it's okay to go home, Dr. Hendricks corrected gently. We spent that day doing all of Tommy's favorite things. We went to the park where he'd learned to ride his bike, where he'd scraped his knee countless times and run to me for comfort. We had ice cream for breakfast and pizza for lunch. We played board games and watched his favorite movies. But underneath it all was the knowledge that we were saying goodbye. As evening approached, Tommy began to change. The shimmer I'd seen the day before became more pronounced, and I could tell he was already beginning to slip away from our world. He moved differently, spoke differently, as if he was remembering how to be what he truly was. I need to pack, he said at around 6 o'clock, but when I asked what he wanted to take, he shook his head. I can't take anything from here. But I'll remember everything. At 11:45 p.m., we gathered in the backyard. Dr. Hendricks had drawn symbols on the ground with what looked like silver chalk, and the air around the symbols seemed to vibrate with energy. The process is simple, Dr. Hendricks explained. Tommy will stand in the center of the circle, and his family will come for him. You can say goodbye, but once the transition begins, you cannot try to stop it. Tommy hugged us both, and I memorized everything about that moment, the way he smelled like grass in boyhood, the way his hair felt under my fingers, the warmth of his small body against mine. I love you, Mommy, he said. I love you, Daddy. Thank you for teaching me about love. We love you too, sweetheart, I said. Always. Tommy stepped into the circle, and immediately, the air around him began to change. The shimmer became a glow, and through that glow, I could see figures approaching, tall, graceful beings who moved with Tommy's fluid grace. My family, Tommy said, and his voice was filled with joy. They're here. The figures reached for Tommy, and he reached back. As their hands touched, Tommy began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone. But just before he disappeared completely, he looked back at us one more time. I'll always remember, he said, and then he was gone. The circle of symbols went dark, and Dr. Hendricks began erasing them from the ground. It's done, he said quietly. Tommy is home. David and I stood in our backyard, holding each other, grieving the loss of our son while trying to find comfort in the knowledge that he was where he belonged. Will we ever see him again? I asked. Dr. Hendricks paused in his work. Love transcends boundaries, Mrs. Chen. What you built with Tommy, what you gave him, that kind of love finds a way to continue. As we walked back to our house, I felt a gentle breeze that carried the scent of something I'd never smelled before, like starlight and silver bells. And in that breeze, I heard a whisper. Thank you for loving me. I knew then that Tommy was truly home, and that somewhere, in a place between worlds, he was happy. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is dark and the air is still, I can still feel his presence, still hear his voice carried on the wind. I love you, Mommy. I love you, Daddy. Always.